August 1942. A single tanker named Ohio limps into the harbor at Malta. She carries 12,000 tons of fuel, and that one ship may have saved an entire island from surrender. The Axis threw everything they had at her: submarines, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and still she came. Here is why one battered tanker mattered more than an entire battle fleet. To understand Ohio, you must first understand Malta, a tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean. 95 miles south of Sicily, right across the throat of the Axis supply lines to North Africa. Whoever held Malta controlled who could move supplies across the Mediterranean. And in 1942, that mattered enormously. From Malta, British submarines and aircraft struck at the Italian and German convoys feeding Rommel's army in Africa. Each month, Axis supply ships burned in the sea, and each month, Rommel's tanks ran lower on fuel. So the Axis decided to remove the problem, not by invasion, by starvation. In early 1942, the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force began pounding Malta day and night. The harbors became graveyards of sunken ships. The airfields were cratered beyond use. Then the Axis cut the supply lines to the island itself. The siege of Malta had begun. By mid-1942, food was rationed to starvation levels. Bread was almost gone. The island had enough fuel for its aircraft to fly for only a few more weeks. Then it would be over. London faced a terrible choice: let Malta fall or run a convoy through the Axis gauntlet. So London chose the Convoy, and not just any convoy, the largest the Royal Navy had ever assembled. Its code name was Operation Pedestal. Its goal was simple: get 14 merchant ships to Malta alive. To protect them, the Royal Navy scraped together a force of nearly 100 warships. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. Even the aircraft carriers were sacrificed as shields. Their fighters would fly cover for the merchant ships. And at the center of it all sat Ohio, a tanker so new she had never yet carried a cargo. Ohio was an American ship, built in Texas. Her crew was a mix of British and American merchant sailors. She carried the most precious cargo of all: aviation fuel, the lifeblood of Malta's last aircraft. 10,000 tons of kerosene for the fighters, 2,000 tons of diesel for the submarines. But the Axis knew the Convoy was coming. Their aircraft had watched it form in the west. On the 10th of August, Pedestal passed through the Strait of Gibraltar. The gauntlet had begun. For 2 days, the fleet sailed east in silence. Then the enemy struck with everything at once. German and Italian aircraft came in waves. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves. Dive bombers fell from the sun. The escorting fighters were stretched thin. They could not be everywhere at once. And beneath the waves, the submarines waited. The Italian Navy had laid a line of them across the convoy's path. On the 12th of August, the real battle began. The sky turned black with aircraft. The first wave came in at midday. German Junkers 88 dive bombers fell out of the high sun. Their bombs straddled the merchant ships, but the real killers came from below the waterline. The Italian submarines lay in a picket line, stretched across the convoy's path like a net. The first torpedo struck the aircraft carrier Eagle. She was the oldest carrier in the fleet. 4 torpedoes in quick succession. She rolled over and sank in under 8 minutes. Over 200 of her crew went down with her, and with them, 16 precious fighter aircraft. The loss of 16 fighters was a blow. The convoy's aerial cover had just grown thinner. That afternoon, the carrier Indomitable took 3 bomb hits. Her flight deck was a wreck. She could no longer launch her aircraft. The convoy's protective umbrella had a hole in it. Yet the worst was still to come. The convoy had to pass the Skirky Bank at night. Skirky Bank is a shallow ridge of seabed between Sicily and Tunisia, a natural bottleneck. Here the convoy had to slow down, and here the Italian cruisers waited in ambush. At just after midnight, the Italian force opened fire. Star shells lit the sky like daylight. In that terrible light, the cruiser Manchester took a torpedo in her side. Her fate was sealed. Her captain ordered the ship abandoned. The crew went into the water. She sank at dawn. The night battles scattered the convoy. Merchant ships broke formation and fled in every direction. By dawn, the surviving ships were scattered across 50 miles of open sea. And somewhere among them, alone and crippled, steamed the tanker Ohio. She had already taken a torpedo in her engine room. Her speed was gone. Her pumps were failing, and the sea was slowly coming in through her side. Yet the decision was made. Ohio would not be abandoned. Her cargo was too precious to let sink. Malta had to have that fuel. So the Royal Navy did something extraordinary. They lashed destroyers to her sides. 2 destroyers, one on each side, would steer her, like a wounded animal held up by its handlers. It was a desperate tactic, and it would be needed again and again. Because the Axis still hunted her, Stuka dive bombers came at her in the afternoon. Their bombs walked across her deck. One hit her forward and started a fire. Fire on a tanker full of aviation fuel. The crew knew what that meant. One spark reaching the tanks below, and the whole ship would vanish in a single blast. The fire crews smothered the flames with foam. Inch by inch, they pushed it back. But the bombs kept coming. The Stukas returned in wave after wave. And each attack left Ohio lower in the water. The sea was winning its slow fight. The destroyers held her steady, but the sea was not their only enemy. The Luftwaffe had one standing order: stop Ohio at any cost. That afternoon, the Stukas came back a 3rd time, and they scored a direct hit. The bomb tore through Ohio's deck. It detonated deep inside the hull. And still, the tanks did not explode. That was the miracle of Ohio. Some crews called it luck, but her builders had made her tough. Ohio was an American-built ship. Launched in 1940, she had crossed the Atlantic under her own power. She was a standard fleet tanker, not a warship, just a civilian workhorse pressed into service. But her crew were not civilians anymore. They were volunteers sailing into the teeth of the Axis. On August 13th, Ohio was still afloat, but barely. She was down at the bow, her engines were dead, her steering was gone. Her pumps had failed completely, and the sea had found its way into her engine room. The destroyers had to work harder now, their engines strained against her dead weight. And then the Italians sent in their submarines, a final hunter-killer line. They fired torpedoes at the crippled Ohio, and the destroyers turned to meet them. One torpedo passed close enough to brush her hull, the other missed by yards. The torpedoes missed, but the hunt was far from over. Through the night, the little flotilla crept toward Malta, barely making 4 knots. Every mile was bought with the fuel of the escorting destroyers. And Ohio's own tanks were now useless. She had nothing left to burn. The destroyers were burning their own reserves to drag her home. And then the sky cleared. The Stukas were coming back for a 4th time. The destroyers had no fighter cover left. They were on their own. Their anti-aircraft guns opened up. Every barrel that could bear fired. The bombs fell around Ohio in a curtain of white water. Yet Ohio did not stop. The destroyers held her course. By late afternoon, the air attacks finally thinned. The Stukas had to break off. But the fuel problem had become critical. The destroyers were running dry themselves. Some of the escorts had to turn back. There was simply nothing left in their tanks. Ohio was left with a skeleton escort, a handful of destroyers and minesweepers. And Malta itself was now visible on the horizon, a thin line of rock and stone. But the last miles were the most dangerous. The approaches were mined and watched. The minesweepers went in first. They swept a narrow channel through the minefield ahead. Behind them came Ohio, wallowing in the tow of her 2 destroyers. Every gun on every escort was loaded and watching the sky. And then, off the port bow, a periscope broke the surface. The destroyer pen turned hard to starboard. She rammed the submarine at full speed. The Italian submarine sank in seconds. Ohio sailed on, unharmed. But the last approach to Malta was a gauntlet of mines, guns, and waiting aircraft. The coastal guns on Malta's own shore opened up on their approaching friends. They were firing at enemy aircraft, but the shells fell short into the water around the convoy. It was a final, nerve-shredding irony. The island's own guns nearly finished the job the Axis started. By noon, Ohio was inside the outer harbor. The worst was over, almost. But the harbor mouth was narrow, and Ohio could barely steer at all. Her tow parted twice at the harbor entrance. Each time, the destroyers reattached it. Finally, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ohio came to rest against the quay. She was down by the bow. Her deck was a ruin of twisted steel. But her cargo tanks were intact. 12,000 tons of fuel had come through. The island erupted in joy. Crowds lined the stone quays to watch her come in. But the celebration was premature. The unloading had barely begun when the air raid sirens sounded again. Stukas and Ju-88s came down on the harbor in one final, desperate raid. Ohio had survived the open sea. Now she had to survive the dock. Bombs straddled the length of the ship. One near-miss tore open her already wounded side. Water poured into her forward compartments. Ohio began to settle lower into the harbor. Her deck was nearly awash. It looked as if she would go down at her moorings. The dockyard crews worked with desperate speed. They ran hoses and pumps aboard within minutes. They pumped her dry faster than the water could come in. Inch by inch, Ohio came back up. The fuel was now the only thing that mattered. It had to come out of her tanks, and fast. Every hour of unloading was another hour under the guns of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe came back again and again, but each time the guns and the Spitfires drove them off. By nightfall, the dockyard crews had the tanks open. The precious fuel was flowing ashore. In the end, roughly 11,000 tons of fuel were saved from Ohio's tanks. Of the 14 merchant ships that sailed with Pedestal, only 5 reached Malta. But those 5 ships carried what Malta needed most: food, ammunition, and that one priceless cargo of fuel. Now the dockyard crews faced a second race, getting the cargo off before the next raid came. The fuel flowed through hoses into waiting storage tanks on the island. But Ohio was far from the only ship in that harbor worth bombing. The destroyer Penn, the very ship that had rammed the submarine, was also unloading. Every escort that survived carried ammunition and food for the garrison. The Luftwaffe kept probing, but the harbor guns now had their full attention on the sky. On the night of the 15th of August, the last of the cargo came ashore. But the cost of Pedestal was written in the ledger of the ships that did not come back. 9 merchant ships were lost. 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer went down with them. Hundreds of sailors and merchant seamen were lost with them. The human price was severe. Yet measured by what it delivered, Pedestal was one of the most decisive operations of the war. Malta was no longer on the edge of surrender. The island could fight on. With fuel in the tanks, the Spitfires and Beaufighters could take off and strike the Axis convoys again. And those strikes would change the entire balance of the Desert War in North Africa. For the Axis, the math was now brutally simple. Their supply line ran past an armed island. Every ton of fuel and ammunition they sent to Africa had to run the gauntlet of Malta's bombers. So the Axis did what any besieging army would do. They tried to cut the supply line at its source. Every Axis convoy to Africa now had to run the gauntlet of Malta's airfields. The losses were staggering. In the weeks after Pedestal, the Axis shipping losses climbed sharply. In September of 1942, the Axis lost nearly a third of all the cargo they sent to Libya. That was not a small dent. That was a mortal wound to an army that lived on supply. And the man who felt that wound most keenly was the commander of the Africa Corps. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his supply situation was turning desperate. Rommel was at the very gates of Egypt. His army had pushed to within striking distance of Alexandria. But his tanks were running on fumes. His ammunition was counted in rounds per gun. Every tank he lost to fuel shortage was a tank that could not be replaced. The fuel that Ohio carried was not just for Malta. It was fuel that Rommel would never receive. Because every ton of fuel that reached Malta was a ton denied to the Africa Corps. With Malta's aircraft flying again, the Desert War began to turn on its hinge. By late October, Rommel's supply line was so starved that his army could barely move. And then the British 8th Army struck back at a place called El Alamein. It began on the 23rd of October, 1942, the largest battle of the Desert War. At El Alamein, the armies met on a narrow strip of desert between the sea and the Qattara Depression. The ground was so narrow that neither army could outflank the other. It became a war of attrition. And attrition is a battle of supply. Whoever ran dry first would lose the Desert War. The 8th Army had a secure supply line running back to the Nile Delta. Rommel had 1,000 miles of it. That was the real difference at El Alamein, not generalship, not courage, logistics. For 12 days, the 8th Army hammered Rommel's lines with artillery and massed infantry. Rommel's tanks could not maneuver. They had no fuel to swing around the British flank. On the 4th of November, the Axis line finally broke. Rommel ordered a general retreat. But the retreat was not a clean withdrawal. It was a rout driven by empty fuel tanks. The Afrika Korps lost hundreds of vehicles in that retreat. Most were abandoned, not destroyed in battle. And this is where the thread leads back to Ohio. The fuel she carried had denied Rommel his own. Every gallon that reached Malta was a gallon that never reached a German tank in Egypt. Historians still debate how much of Rommel's defeat belongs to Malta's air power. The numbers are persuasive. What is beyond dispute is the mechanism. Starve an army of fuel and its tanks become monuments. The pursuit after El Alamein ran for over 1,000 miles. Rommel's army was chased all the way to Tunisia. And that pursuit would not have been possible without the fuel that Ohio had risked everything to deliver. So how did one convoy change the course of a war that stretched across 3 continents? The answer lies in the arithmetic of the Mediterranean War in the autumn of 1942. Every ship that reached Malta was a ship the Axis could not count on the other side of the ledger. And the British understood this arithmetic better than anyone. They had built an empire on it. But the story of Pedestal did not end with the ships in the harbor. It continued underground. Malta is not just an island fortress above ground. Beneath, it runs a labyrinth of tunnels and galleries. By 1942, the entire population of the island could shelter in these caves during an air raid. The caves held the people, and the people held the island, and the island held the Mediterranean. The fuel that Ohio delivered was stored in those tunnels, fuel that would soon power aircraft again. And those aircraft were about to do more than defend Malta. They were about to go on the offensive. By November of 1942, Malta's strike squadrons were flying against Axis shipping every day. The Axis supply line to North Africa was now a shooting gallery, and the Afrika Korps was the target. But the Mediterranean was not the only front where the tide was turning. Far away, in the Pacific, another war raged. And on the Eastern Front, the German army was about to walk into a trap at a city called Stalingrad. 1942 was the hinge of the entire war, and the Mediterranean was its most contested door. And at the very center of that door stood a battered tanker named Ohio. Her story was not yet finished. In late November, the surviving ships of Pedestal were still in Malta's harbors. But Ohio herself was a wreck. Her back was broken, her decks were awash. The Royal Navy knew she could never sail again, and that was fine. Her job was done. Her tanks had been pumped dry. 12,000 tons of fuel now sat in the island's underground stores. Within weeks, that fuel was feeding the aircraft that were sinking Axis supply ships by the dozen. And here is a detail most accounts miss. Ohio had carried more than fuel. She carried aviation spirit. High-octane aviation fuel, the exact kind the Spitfires and Beauforts of Malta needed to fight. Without that spirit, Malta's fighters could not have flown the sorties that broke the Axis line. But Ohio was not the only hero of that convoy. The story of Pedestal has many names. The cruiser Manchester was lost in that gauntlet. Her sacrifice bought time for the convoy. Her crew scuttled her after she was crippled. a painful decision made to save lives. The destroyer force bore the worst of it. They were the shield that took the blows. And the merchant seamen, the civilians who sailed unarmed into that fire, they asked for no medals. Of the 14 merchant ships that left England, only 5 reached Malta. 5 out of 14. 9 ships at the bottom of the Mediterranean, hundreds of seamen lost, and still the convoy worked. Because the measure of a convoy is not how many ships arrive, it is what those ships carry. That is the deeper truth of Pedestal. It was never really about ships at all. It was about fuel and food and the will of an island to keep fighting. And when the last Pedestal ship was unloaded, the Axis finally understood what they had lost. Because a convoy is not a battle, it is a statement of intent. The British were telling the world they would not give up Malta. Not now, not ever. And that message reached more than the enemy. It reached the people of Malta themselves. For 2 years they had endured the bombs, the rationing, the constant hunger. The arrival of that convoy told them the world had not forgotten them. That mattered, because morale on Malta was a weapon the Axis could not bomb away. Now, historians often argue over which single event turned the Mediterranean War. Some point to El Alamein, others to the landings in North Africa. Both had their moment. But the supply line, those battles depended on ran straight through Malta's reach. Without Malta's aircraft, Rommel's army starved of fuel at the worst possible moments. And a starving army cannot advance, not against an enemy that still has petrol. That is the quiet arithmetic of war, the math that decides battles before a shot is fired. And no convoy in history had paid more for that arithmetic than Pedestal did in August of 42. So what did Pedestal actually change on the ground in the weeks that followed? The fuel arrived at the exact moment Malta's airfields were running dry. British intelligence later estimated that Pedestal bought Malta another 8 weeks of effective resistance. 8 weeks, that was the window the island needed to survive the autumn. And in those 8 weeks, the island's bombers resumed their deadly work against the Axis supply lanes. Every Axis tanker heading to North Africa now had to run a gauntlet of torpedo bombers. The numbers tell the story. Axis shipping losses to Malta-based aircraft climbed sharply from September onward. By October, the Axis supply situation in North Africa had become critical. Rommel's army was burning fuel it could not replace, and he knew it. The historians who study supply say the Axis never fully recovered from that autumn. Now consider the human cost of that arithmetic, because it was paid in lives. The official record lists the Pedestal casualties in the hundreds, naval and merchant, British and Allied. Every one of those names was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. And yet the men who survived the convoy insisted it was worth the price. Because they had seen the faces of the Maltese when the cargo came ashore. That moment, more than any statistic, is what Operation Pedestal was really about. And that story did not end in August of 1942. It carried forward into the rest of the war. For the islanders, the relief was real, but the war around them had not gone away. The Axis still held Sicily, their bombers still came, the siege was broken but not lifted. But the balance had shifted. and shifting balances in war tend to gather speed. Within months, the Allies were planning their next move, not a relief convoy, an invasion. That invasion was Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in November of 1942. Historians note a quiet but crucial detail: the Axis could not spare the strength to stop it. Their air power was stretched thin, their navy was spent, their supply line was bleeding. And Malta, the island they had tried to starve, was now the knife at their throat. Because Pedestal had done more than deliver fuel, it had restored Malta as a forward base. From that base, British submarines and aircraft now hunted the Axis convoys with new fury. Every ton of Axis fuel lost at sea now meant a ton of ground lost in Africa. The campaign in North Africa turned, and it turned in large part on that arithmetic. By the spring of 1943, the Axis was gone from Africa entirely. And the next step of the war, the invasion of Sicily, was launched from the very airfields Malta had been denied. Malta, the island the Axis had tried to starve into surrender, had become the springboard of their defeat. So the question becomes a simple one: did Pedestal actually win the war in the Mediterranean? The honest answer is no. No single convoy wins a war. But Pedestal bought the thing that wins wars: time, and the time to strike. Consider what followed in the year after Ohio limped into harbor. In September of 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. The Italian fleet sailed to Malta to surrender, to the very island that had endured the siege. That moment carries a weight that historians still point to. The besieged had become the victors. And so we return to the tanker that started this story, the Ohio herself. After the war, the Ohio was repaired and returned to civilian service under the American flag. She served for years, a working ship with a legend attached to her name. Her final voyage came in 1959. She ran aground off the coast of Spain. She was declared a total loss and scrapped where she lay, a quiet end for a famous ship. But her name never faded, because her story had become part of Malta's own. Today in Malta, the memory of the convoy is kept alive with ceremony and with stone. And the island itself was awarded the George Cross by King George VI for its endurance. That award was not given to a soldier or a general, it was given to an entire people. But the George Cross is a symbol, and symbols, however noble, are not the whole story. Because the real legacy of Pedestal was not a medal, it was a change in how the Mediterranean War was fought. With Malta secure, the Allies could finally take the offensive, and they did, with a weapon the Axis could not match. That weapon was air power, operating from bases that had once been under nightly bombardment. Every Axis convoy that ran to North Africa now ran a gauntlet of submarines, bombers, and torpedo boats. The arithmetic of supply became brutal. The Axis needed hundreds of thousands of tons every month. And each month, a growing fraction of that tonnage ended on the seabed. Fuel, food, ammunition, all of it. This was the quiet war that decided the loud one, the war of tonnage, measured in ledgers and in wrecks. And the man who understood that arithmetic best was the commander of the German forces in Africa, Erwin Rommel. Rommel had warned his high command, again and again, that without supply, his army could not fight. But the German high command was looking east, toward Stalingrad, the Mediterranean was, to them, a sideshow. So Rommel fought his campaign on a trickle of fuel and shells, and the trickle, month by month, became a drought. Historians who study the campaign now point to a single, brutal fact. The Axis lost the supply war before they lost the battles. And that is the deepest lesson of Operation Pedestal, not about courage, though there was courage in abundance. The lesson is about supply, about how wars are truly won or lost, not on the battlefield, but in the ledger book. One tanker carrying 12,000 tons of fuel had tipped that ledger, and the whole Mediterranean turned with it. So let us carry that ledger book lesson forward, because it did not end with the Mediterranean. The same arithmetic of supply would decide the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the war in Europe. Every army that outran its fuel line, every navy that outran its oil, met the same wall that Rommel met. And that is the quiet truth that Operation Pedestal made visible to the whole world. Because when one tanker could hold an island against an empire, the old rules of war had changed. Historians now call the Mediterranean campaign a test case for the logistics of total war. And the lessons learned here were written directly into the Allied plans for the invasion of Europe. The men who planned those landings had studied Pedestal. They knew exactly what supply could and could not do. So when we ask why the Allies won the Second World War, the answer is rarely a single battle. It was the patient, unglamorous work of keeping armies fed, fueled, and armed across oceans. And in the summer of 1942, that quiet work was done by the men and women of one convoy. That is the story of Operation Pedestal, the convoy that broke Malta's starvation and the tanker that refused to give up. If you want more stories of how wars were truly won and lost, subscribe to Colonel Mittens and tell us in the comments which forgotten front to cover next.